All right, moving on to story number 2, which takes us across the pond to the United Kingdom, to merry old England. And since this is the beginning of the month of Spooks and Goblins, it's entirely appropriate that we are in England, Great Britain, the United Kingdom, for this story, since the United Kingdom is haunt of many ghosts and spooks and goblins of the government kind, the bureaucratic kind, the ideological kind, and maybe even the actual supernatural kind, if you put any stock into the old stories and old wives' tales that might have a bit of truth to them. Who's to say? More things in heaven and earth that are dreamt of in our philosophies, Horatio. But that's a topic for another time, gang. This story comes to us from the LGBTQIA2+XYZ news site Pink News. And I just want to read you guys the headline, okay? Because I swear, if you don't preface a lot of these news stories by saying this is not satire, you would honestly think that it was a joke. Here's the headline. As non-binary people, do we really want legal recognition? Or should we be fighting to abolish gender categories entirely? That headline and the accompanying story was written by a guy, I'm just going to say it, named C Benedict. And C Benedict is mad because apparently Parliament is not going to reform the Gender Recognition Act of 2005. Now, the Gender Recognition Act, from the very little research that I did on it, was an act, like I said, passed in 2005 that allows people with gender dysphoria to change their sex. Okay, legally, in the sense, so on birth certificates, on passports, things of that nature, where they ask you for what your gender is, male or female. The Gender Recognition Act allowed people to change it. A male could put female, female could put male, blah, blah, blah. See, Benedict is mad because a lot of people were petitioning the government, arguing that that wasn't enough. That it wasn't enough for an M to become an F, or for an F to become an M on official documentation. You needed another category. You needed an X or an N or a 0 for non-binary people. This is part of what he says, and he's very mad about this. I mean, make no mistake about this. This is in part what he had to say. Buried 130 pages into the report on the Gender Recognition Act, again, a report I have not read, FYI, comes an acknowledgement that there seemed to be an increasing number of people who identified as non-binary, but that there were complex practical consequences for other areas of the law, service provision, and public life if provision were to be made for non-binary gender recognition in the GRA. To visualize this, I imagine an A4 piece of paper with big black letters reading Gender X being pulled through a 20-year-old fax machine, which immediately catches fire and inadvertently blows the fuses all across Whitehall. Or more literally, all our bureaucratic structures are capable of changing a letter in a little box from M to F or F to M, but that box does not have room for other letters. Now, push pause right there, because what C Benedict has done is a classic case of almost snarky equivocation. Okay, now again, I haven't read the 130-page report, but I'm guessing when whoever wrote that report, who seems to have at least a modicum of common sense, at least a thimbleful of common sense, says that there will be practical, complex consequences for other areas of the law and other areas of society if non-binary if non-binary is actually recognized as a gender, which is an oxymoron in and of itself. How can you have a gender that is non-binary when the whole point of, supposedly, by his own logic, being non-binary means that you have no gender? That is actually That is actually true. I take that as absolute truth. And this person who wrote this report, or the people who wrote this report, obviously, like I said, had enough common sense to realize that civilizations, when you get right down to brass tacks, civilizations exist because of the dichotomy, the sexual dichotomy in the human race. I think that it was the humorist Dave Barry who years and years ago cracked that men created civilizations to impress their girlfriends. And you know what? Even though that's a joke, Dave Barry is actually right. Someone who put that in a bit more academic language was Camille Paglia, the well-known feminist and lesbian, FYI, if we're going to actually start shoving identities across at one another. Camille Paglia in Sexual Persona. Well, I don't know if it was in her book Sexual Persona, but elsewhere she has said that if, for example, societies tended toward matriarchies instead of patriarchies, then we'd still be living in grass huts. She said that no, it's this tension. It's the tension between male and female. It's the tension, as she put it in Sexual Persona, between Apollo and Dionysus, the logical, the rational, the orderly, with the chaotic, the impulsive, and just sort of the wild side of humanity. This is what has created civilization. The male and the female coming together. That is what has created civilization, not just biologically, speaking about, the facts of life, but psychologically, anthropologically, motivationally, because as more and more people had families with wives and children and everything, you would come together to protect them. You started associating with others because you needed more food, you needed more protection, blah, 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 blah. We're not going to get into a lecture on all the hypotheses of prehistoric man, okay? Because that is not my area of expertise at all. But, okay, it's a commonsensical position, if you sit down and think about it, that yes, the building block of civilization, if Aristotle is correct, and FYI, he is, when he says that the family is the cornerstone of civilization, which is what he says in his Politics, then from that statement, we can deduce a further step back and say that it is the sexual complementarity between men and women that actually is what allows civilizations to grow. Because again, families only exist because of the sexual complementarity between men and women, regardless of what the Supreme Court and what academia has said to the contrary, okay? So that's the first point, okay? But this is where C Benedict, to continue with this story from Pink News, this is actually where C Benedict goes right for the throat. He goes right for the throat, because this is what he says, to continue, okay? Non-binary people are a stick in the spoke for a system of government that loves its paperwork. We've been put in the too hard basket, which has then been transformed into the too hard can, which has now been kicked down the road. And you know what? Good. Within this system at this time, we need to ask ourselves as non-binary people what good, safe, legal recognition would look like. And I don't believe that creating a third gender category is the way to do that. Jamie Windus, who previously campaigned for an X marker on passports, has reflected that a development like that might actually make us more vulnerable, which begs the question, why is there a gender marker on our passports or anywhere? If you're having to distinguish between three people called Karen Smith on record, then a little F in the corner is unlikely to help. But that is the really complicated thing here, because the baseline of this argument is abolish gender legally. And that sounds and feels a lot more radical than it is, because what I'm talking about is a really properly unsexy reassessment of our bureaucracy. I love, you really have to give some of these people credit for the way that they phrase things. To take a step back, gang, what C Benedict at Pink News just said is that the United Kingdom's government, parliament, should legally abolish gender. And C Benedict makes it sound like, oh, that just means kind of, getting rid of a level of bureaucracy. No. No, no, no. That's a lie. That is a damnable lie. And either C Benedict knows that, which makes him diabolical, or C Benedict doesn't know that at all, which makes him a damn fool. Because legally abolishing gender, that is not getting rid of a level of bureaucracy. Okay, in the first place, that is only going to create more bureaucracy. Because like we just said, the fundamental building block of civilization will have been legally abolished. When you get rid of your foundation, you've got to put in a heck of a lot of stuff in order to keep the house from crumbling into the ground, okay? This sort of thing, that's not going to get rid of bureaucracy. It's only going to create more bureaucracy. It goes back to what Burke said. The more that people cannot control themselves, their own passions, their own vices, their own temperaments, the more that people outside of themselves will control them. People's passions forge their fetters. Repeat it again. People's passions forge their fetters. That's the first and the practical thing. But in the second thing, our politics is not the end-all and be-all of reality or of life. Okay, that's true. But politics, and especially the law, okay, the law, that is supposed to be a reflection of reality, okay? The law is supposed to be a reflection of reality. Cicero said it best, that the law is supposed to be reason in accordance with nature. That's what the law is supposed to be. Okay? So, people observe reality in all of its different facets. History, psychology, philosophy, metaphysics, politics, anthropology, tradition, culture, language, etc., 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 etc. And then they pass laws that recognize that reality, reason in accordance with nature. People can actually sit down, contemplate about reality, deduce what is true, good, and beautiful, and then from those conclusions, they can make just laws which properly reflect reality. So when you legally abolish gender, what you are saying isn't just a removal of a level of bureaucracy. What you are saying is that you are eradicating maleness and femaleness across society. That is what you are doing. And in the third place, if there is no such thing as male or female, and that leaves a whole big vacuum. What do we say here, gang? Nature abhors a vacuum, right? So what's going to fill up that vacuum? See, Benedict doesn't tell you. But I bet that you can kind of start to guess what's going to be filled up by that vacuum. Now, the reason why I brought up this story isn't just because of the preposterousness of what is being proposed, but I wanted to highlight this story because this is a classic example of how totalitarians operate. Totalitarians will say that X is our goal, X is our goal, okay? Whether it's, being able to change your gender moniker from an M to an F, or adding an X to it, that's our goal. That's our goal. And then, when the goal fails, or when the goal is actually achieved, then all of a sudden, the rug is pulled out from under our feet, and the totalitarians say, oh, well, that's not the goal now at all. The goal is now further down the road. We had a brilliant example of this about, let me think here, about 15 years ago or so. Well, maybe not quite that, about 13 years ago. Remember, before the whole debate about gay marriage, there was the whole debate about civil unions, the LGBTQIA2 plus XYZ, etc., supercalifragilisticexpialidocious movement said that they didn't want to get married. They just wanted civil unions so that they could, leave property to their partner, they could have hospital visitation rights, etc., etc. And most people said, okay, sure, yeah, you know what, you're not going to touch marriage. Marriage is between a man and a woman, blah, blah, blah. History shows that, philosophy shows that, anthropology and biology and psychology show that. But yeah, we can have a legal category called civil unions for you guys so that the law sees you equally. You can file jointly, hospital visitations, like I said, you can leave property to each other, etc., etc. And no sooner, practically, had civil unions been okay than the goal switched. Then it was marriage, gay marriage, gay marriage, gay marriage. Because, well, you know what? Civil unions were practically marriages anyway. They just weren't called marriages. So we might as well have the whole cake while we're at it. That is what totalitarians do. Give them an inch, and they will take a mile. This story shows it. We've gone from the goal being, we just want another gender marker for people who don't identify as male or female, to gender should be abolished entirely, which again is going to eradicate maleness and femaleness from society. Again, because of the nature of what the law is and how the law operates. Which means, actually, too, that anyone who defends maleness and femaleness will then be an enemy of the law. And be an enemy of the government, be an enemy of the people. That's how it's going to play out. That's the entire goal of the totalitarian system. Remake society in its own image, and then intimidate people by making examples of people who dare raise their hands, stick their nose up, and actually tell the truth. Make examples of all those people so that all the rest of us fall in line. Classic totalitarian move. That's why I wanted to highlight this story. That is story number 2 for this week.